Hi class, Professor Seeger here. In this video, I will be going over a couple ways sound devices are significant in poems and can even create meaning. I will also go over a couple poetic terms or effects related to sound and the subtle effects they have on the reader. It is best that you are familiar with the formal elements of poetry and the figurative language lectures before you proceed with this one. At this point in the program, please remove yourself from all distractions. Make sure you have a pen and a pad of paper to take notes during the presentation. I'll wait. If I go too quickly, please feel free to stop and rewind as often as you need to. Cheers! Elements of sound are often the most difficult things to discuss in a poem analysis. Typically, if students do identify elements of sound in a paper, they merely identify the element without analyzing or discussing them. Students might identify alliteration in a poem and move on, or note the rhyme scheme without any discussion of its significance. Most analysis papers avoid discussing the sounds of poetry and do just fine. However, if you are able to identify and discuss elements of sound in a poem, you will be able to show a more subtle and sophisticated understanding of poetry, and this opens up any poem to another layer of meaning. English teachers are usually impressed with that kind of stuff. Poetry and music have quite a bit in common. Most contemporary music has lyrics with many poetic elements. Rap is poetry that pays special attention to rhythm. When you look up the lyrics to one of your favorite songs online, you'll notice quickly that those lyrics are presented as poetry, with line breaks and other poetic elements like meter, imagery, personification, etc. Historically, the word lyric is directly related to lyric poetry. At one point, poems were sung like songs with a lyre. Both poetry and music are meant to be experienced and heard. However, unlike songs, poems must carry their music and rhythm inside the words the poet chooses. The music of poetry is a bit more subtle than a face-melting guitar solo, but it is still a powerful element in any poem. Poetry has a soundtrack. The rhythm is the backbeat, the sounds are the melody, and all of it adds up to the music of a poem. Ideally, the images, subject, and theme of the poem are connected to that soundtrack and add up to an overall experience of language and meaning. Since poems are meant to be heard aloud, the sound must be important, right? What sound does the rain make? Drip, drop, splash, plink, 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 splish, drip, drip, drip. Onomatopoeia is when a word imitates the sound that the word makes, as in the word rain, drop. The word drop imitates the sound of rain. However, when we think about it, there are numerous different sounds for rain, in nature and in literature. Some of the variety depends on the type of rain. However, another large part has to do with the speaker's attitude towards the rain. This can reveal a lot about a speaker. It can hint at themes in a work of literature. However, those sounds, in a lot of ways, are also up to the listener. Typically, literature is a collaboration between the author and the reader in order to create meaning. So interpretation of these sorts of sounds are often a balance between a reader's personal experience and the literary context of that sound. When we consider rain, what does each of the sounds suggest about the rain without context? The rain may sound differently from one person's perspective than another person's. External factors have to be considered as well. What kind of rain? What is the rain landing on? Experience has a lot to do with interpretation too. Does the person describing the sound like or dislike the rain? Is rain a common or uncommon occurrence? Is the rain pretty or inconvenient? Do we hear things differently? Yes, we do. So sound is up to the listener in many ways, but we also have to consider the context of the situation. Just because we hate rain doesn't mean the speaker of the poem does. But what does sound do? Words are made up of sounds. That's a fact. Words are made up of sounds. Some sounds carry associations. For example, ooh could be scary, could be excited, could be admiring something, could be taunting. Ah, or ah, could be relaxed or surprised. Am I cold? Frightened? Am I being silly? Is something tasty? Is the person being serious or polite? Is someone talking with their mouth full? Of course, all these are exaggerated sounds, the kind we might read in a comic book or hear in a Scooby-Doo cartoon. But we react to those sounds, even when they are more subtly presented in the various words, like the oo sound in gruesome, or the k sound in the word cold. Words aren't just sounds, though. It is certainly more important to know the meaning of words. Understanding the effects of sounds, however, does add to our understanding and experience of language, and it can often be considered with productive results. Sounds evoke a mood, create an atmosphere, and can even convey emotions. Sounds surround us and are representative of other things. Chances are that each of us may interpret these sounds with differences based on our individual experiences of the world. Often, sounds can either reinforce the emotion of a situation, or they can contrast the situation. Typically, sounds that contrast the context of the situation are more difficult and interesting to discuss. Sounds and rhythms might be worth discussing, but they aren't the most important parts of a poem. They work with the most important parts, which are the words and images the poet selects to express those ideas, feelings, stories, etc. All of these things are only secondary to the larger elements of a poem. They lend to our experience of a poem, but don't form it by themselves. When sounds do seem to do something significant to how you, as a reader, experience or understand a poem, then we have to talk about them. And it's important to know the right words. Poems are concerned with conveying things which are difficult to convey, emotions, moments, images, and so on. Poems are meant to be read aloud, vocalized. They are supposed to make sound. Sound in poetry takes the form of rhythm, rhyme, and repetition. These patterns of sound inherent in the words chosen by the poet create a sort of soundtrack, an additional level of meaning, and an aural experience of language. Rhythm is produced by a series of recurrences, a drum beat, typing keys, stepping feet. But there is a rhythm to words and sounds as well, especially in poetry. Some of that rhythm is the result of repeated sounds, like that K sound in Those Winter Sundays. But most rhythm in poetry is the result of stresses or accents on syllables in words. A stress on a syllable has to do with how we say the word, and it can get confusing because of the differences in how we each speak. But overall, we can identify the stresses in most words. There are even markers poets use to scan a word or phrase for stresses. Scansion is the word for marking all the stressed and unstressed syllables in a poem. Here's a mnemonic device that helps. An unstressed syllable mark looks like a hammock, while a stressed syllable mark looks like someone's hair standing on end. Most words have stresses. Some don't. Prepositions like at, by, or for, and articles like a, an, or the don't really get stressed when we speak unless we want to make a point. Read the quoted passage aloud. Can you hear the rhythm of it? How would you mark or scan these words? Rhythms are inherent in the motion of the moon and stars, even though, when they move, we hear no sound. How many different ways can you say this phrase without sounding exaggerated? Where did you stumble the first time you read through? Consider these stumbles as information about the stresses and rhythms of a passage. Scanning a poem for meter is when we pay special attention to its rhythm by marking the stress value of each syllable. Why do we do this? We bother to scan poems in order to identify their meter and rhythms to better identify the subtle effects they have on the reader. These rhythms are important to the experience of the poem and can be significant to its meaning as well. Consider the rhythm of the following passage. How and why does it seem appropriate for the subject matter? The Weary Blues by Langston Hughes. Rocking back and forth to a mellow croon, I heard a Negro play down on Lenox Avenue the other night, by the pale dull pallor of an old gas light. He did a lazy sway, he did a lazy sway, to the tune of those weary blues. I scanned the first line for you. Quickly scan the rest of the poem. Notice the patterns and notice where the patterns break. Why does the pattern and the breaking of it seem appropriate in this poem? What does it suggest about the subject matter? What makes it a blues? Now, consider what types of rhythmic patterns you might expect from different sorts of poems. From a horse riding poem, a funny poem with a title like The Hippopotamus, a poem about soldiers marching, a poem called A Boogie. Another aspect of sound that becomes important to poetry is rhythm. Essentially, rhythm in poetry is the pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables throughout the poem. All poems, all speech, has some sort of rhythm. It may be choppy or inconsistent, but there will always be a sort of rhythm, even if it's bad rhythm. Think about drum beats or the tempo of songs. Meter, however, is when poems adhere to a regular pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables. However, most poems will not strictly adhere to a single type of meter unless they are short and do so for effect. Consider Frost's poem Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening. It is about the speaker riding a carriage, and you can almost hear the metrical clop of the horse hoofs because of the meter. Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening by Robert Frost. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near. Between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year, he gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sound's the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Typically, however, meters that are too strict tend to bore the reader and dull the subject matter. In fact, the monotonous tone and meter in the Frost poem above may lend towards the weariness that the speaker feels. Some rhythms, however, are harder to scan. This is because everyone speaks a little differently because of various encounters we each have with the English language. My parents, for example, are German immigrants. Therefore, sometimes when I was young, I would emphasize the wrong syllables of a word. In extreme cases, this made the word I was trying to say indecipherable. However, often the more subtle differences create charming accents and dialects. However, many sound patterns are obvious